November 13th, 1942. 1:48 in the morning on the bridge of the destroyer Amatsu Kaz, in Iron Bottom Sound. Commander Tamichi Har held the bridge railing tightly as bright flares exploded above, lighting up his destroyer in a stark white glow. For 2 decades, the Japanese Imperial Navy had mastered fighting at night, turning it into a special skill. Now American shells were landing all around his ship before his lookouts could even see the flash from the enemy's guns. Before we continue, show your support by subscribing and letting me know where you're watching from. Through the bridge windows, Har saw something that went against 20 years of Japanese Navy teachings. American ships were shooting accurately from over 10,000 yards away in total darkness, their shells hitting with machine-like precision. No searchlights gave away their locations. No flares came before their shots. The USS Helena's radar-guided guns had found Amatsukaze, and when Hara kept his searchlights on too long, trying to spot his attackers, the American cruiser's 6-inch shells killed 43 of his men. 3 kilometers away, the battleship Hiei shook from the constant shelling from ships her lookouts couldn't find. The pride of the Imperial fleet, a hero of Pearl Harbor, was being taken apart, piece by enemies fighting from beyond what the eye could see. What no Japanese officer understood yet was that they were seeing the first use of the SG surface search radar, a technology that would change sea battles and take away Japan's most important tactical edge in just 18 months. The numbers of their failure weren't being counted in lost ships or given up land, but in how 20 years of training, teachings, and national planning suddenly became useless. It was all built on one main belief, that the Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the night. The Imperial Japanese Navy's skill in night battles had been developed since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905. At the Battle of Tsushima, Admiral Togo's torpedo boats had wrecked the Russian fleet in the dark. This win became a sacred story, making night fighting the foundation of Japanese naval plans for beating enemies with more ships. By 1942, this idea had grown into the most advanced night fighting system in the world. Japanese sailors practiced over and over in the dark. Lookouts went through special training to improve their night vision, spending hours in dark rooms, making sure they had enough vitamin A, and practicing guessing distances in dim light. The typical Japanese lookout could see ship outlines at 7,000 meters on a night with no moon, double the distance of their American counterparts. The difference in technology seemed to prove Japanese strength. While America depended on basic radar sets that most captains didn't trust, Japanese optics were the best in the world. Their binoculars, made by Nippon Kogaku, later known as Nikon, gave amazing zoom with great light-gathering power. Their Type 93 long-lance torpedoes could hit targets 24,000 yards away, far past any range at which American ships could spot them at night. The start of the Pacific War seemed to confirm every belief. At the Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, Japanese cruisers had wiped out an Allied force in 33 minutes of night fighting, sinking 4 heavy cruisers without losing one ship. At the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30, 1942, a single Japanese destroyer group would badly damage a larger American cruiser force, hitting 4 ships with torpedoes in minutes. Unknown to the Imperial Navy, a huge change in radar technology was happening in American shipyards and labs. The SG surface search radar, created with help from the MIT Radiation Laboratory and the Naval Research Laboratory, was a huge jump from the simple sets that had failed at Savo Island. Working on a 10-centimeter wavelength with 50 kilowatt of power, the SG radar could spot a destroyer at 15 nautical miles and follow it closely enough for blind firing at 10 miles. The MIT Radiation Laboratory, started in November 1940, had grown to almost 4,000 workers by 1943. The basis of their work was the cavity magnetron, brought by the British Teasard mission in September 1940, a device historian James Finney Baxter III called the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. This technology allowed for the making of about 1,000 SG radar sets during the war. The first Fletcher-class destroyer, USS Fletcher, DD-445, which started service on June 30, 1942, had this game-changing system as part of its standard gear. By November 1942, the Fletcher itself was in the Solomon Islands, but she would be the only Fletcher-class destroyer at the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The Plan Position Indicator, PPI scope, gave a godlike view of the battle area, showing all contacts on a round screen that refreshed every 2 seconds. Operators could tell the difference between ship types by their radar signals, track torpedo wakes, and even find periscope depth submarines. The system worked just as well in daylight or darkness, good weather or storm, smoke or fog. The SG radar was connected with the Mark 37 gun director, which was linked to an early computer that could figure out firing solutions in seconds, automatically correcting for target speed, direction, wind, and the ship's movement. The 5-inch 38 caliber guns, the standard weapon on Fletcher-class destroyers, could fire 15 to 20 shots a minute with radar-guided accuracy. The night of November 12th to 13th, 1942, would start the breaking of Japanese beliefs. The naval battle of Guadalcanal started when Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's task force stopped Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's bombing group as it neared Henderson Field. While only the USS Fletcher was a new class of destroyer, several ships had SG radar, including the USS Helena. At 1:24 in the morning, the USS Helena's SG radar found Japanese ships at 27,000 yards, far past what could be seen. For the next 20 minutes, American radar operators tracked the approaching Japanese force, while Japanese lookouts looked uselessly into the darkness. The battle turned into a mess as American radar-guided fire broke up Japanese formations before they could use their better night fighting skills. The destroyer Akatsuki, trying its special night torpedo attack, was caught in radar-guided fire from many American ships. It blew up and sank in minutes. Commander Hara Onamatsu Kaze felt this new reality up close. His ship successfully torpedoed the USS Barton, breaking it in half, and the USS Juno, leaving it badly damaged. But when he lit up the USS San Francisco with searchlights to aim better, the USS Helena's radar-guided guns immediately found Amatsukaze in the dark, causing major damage and many deaths. The battleship Hiei, Admiral Abe's flagship, became the main target of American radar-guided fire. In darkness and rain that should have hidden her, she took 85 shell hits from enemies shooting from distances beyond Japanese sight. Her bridge was destroyed, her steering was broken, and her upper structure was on fire. She would be sunk the next day. The first Japanese battleship lost in the war. The difference between Japanese and American night fighting abilities became more and more clear through late 1942 and early 1943. The American SG radar worked at 3 GHz with 50 kHz of peak power, spotting destroyers at over 15 nautical miles with an accuracy of plus or minus 40 yards in distance and plus or minus 0.5 degrees in direction. It weighed 1,000 pounds and was working 95% of the time, making it useful for putting on many ships. In comparison, the Japanese Type 22 radar worked at 150 MHz with only 2 kV of peak power, finding destroyers at 10 nautical miles in perfect conditions, with an accuracy of plus or minus 300 yards in distance and plus or minus 5 degrees in direction. Weighing 2,200 pounds and only working 40% of the time, it was both clumsy and not dependable. Of the first 60 Type 22 sets made, only about 6 really worked. Total Japanese radar production during the war was only about 300 units, less than a third of American SG production by itself. The technology difference showed deeper problems in their organization. Japan had actually created cavity magnetrons by 1937, and Dr. Hidetsugu Yagi had invented the directional antenna that has his name in 1926. Yet, military leaders kept Yagi out of radar work. When Japanese forces took British radar gear with Yagi antennas, they didn't know the design was named after a Japanese invention. Fights between the Army and Navy stopped them from working together, with both groups making their own separate systems that didn't work with each other. During the Battle of Vella Lavella on October 6 to 7, 1943, the USS Selfridge found and tracked Long Lance torpedoes using radar, letting them dodge weapons that had always been deadly in past battles. The Fletcher-class destroyer's radar advantage was more than just simple detection. It gave them total tactical control. The Tokyo Express, high-speed destroyer trips to bring supplies to Guadalcanal, had completely relied on Japanese night fighting skill. These trips, led by the best destroyer captains in the Imperial Navy, started to have more and more losses to American ships with radar. Captain Raizo Tanaka, who led the 2nd Destroyer Squadron and many Tokyo Express runs, would later write in his 1956 U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings article, Japan's Losing Struggle for Guadalcanal, about the growing American radar advantage. Even though Tanaka's own smart tactics had won at Tasafaranga, he knew that darkness no longer offered safety from American technology. By early 1943, American destroyers were stopping Tokyo Express runs in total darkness, in rain, and in stormy weather. They shot first, shot accurately, and chased Japanese forces even when they ran at full speed into the night. The night of November 25, 1943, showed the complete switch in tactical power. 5 destroyers under Captain Arleigh Burke stopped 5 Japanese destroyers off Cape St. George. In a running fight that was done entirely by radar, Burke's squadron sank 3 Japanese destroyers, Onami, Makinami, and Yugiri, without taking much damage. The Japanese never saw their attackers with their own eyes. This would be the last surface fight in the Solomon Islands and was the end of major surface battles in the area. By mid-1943, Japanese naval commanders were frantically trying to change to the new situation. The death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in April 1943 took away the leader who might have best understood what American technology meant. Japanese efforts to fight American radar were useless. They used simple radar defense measures like aluminum strips called gimenshi or deception paper, but these didn't work against the advanced SG radar. Japanese radar development, held back by fights between services and a lack of resources, stayed years behind American technology. Commander Tamechi Hara, who survived the war as the only destroyer captain from Pearl Harbor to do so, would later write in his book, Japanese Destroyer Captain, about the growing understanding among Japanese officers that their night fighting skill had become outdated. Although his book has some mistakes, his view of American technological power was correct. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 2, 1943, gave the clearest proof of how radar had changed sea battles. Rear Admiral Aaron Merrill's Task Force 39, with several Fletcher-class destroyers that had the newest SG radar upgrades, stopped a larger Japanese force under Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori. At 2:27 in the morning, radar contact at 35,900 yards gave the Americans total tactical control. For the next hours, American ships followed the approaching enemy with perfect clarity, moving into the best shooting positions while staying hidden from Japanese lookouts. The American destroyers showed skills that seemed magical to Japanese watchers. Ships fought at distances over 14,000 yards in total darkness, landing hits with their first shots. They found and dodged long-lance torpedoes by tracking their wakes with radar, then attacked the destroyers that launched them without ever seeing them. The result of the battle stunned the Japanese high command. Even with more ships and firepower, Omori's force was beaten, losing the light cruiser Sendai and the destroyer Hatsukaze while causing very little damage. Samuel Eliot Morrison pointed out that this battle ended Japan's earlier advantage in night fights. The effect on the minds of Japanese Navy men went beyond just a tactical loss. Men who had spent years mastering their night fighting skills watched with no power as technology made their skills worthless. The drop in morale was written down in Japanese operational reports. The famous long-lance torpedoes, launched at radar-guided guesses, increasingly hit nothing but empty water. Top destroyer crews who had thought of themselves as masters of night fighting found they could do nothing against an enemy they couldn't see. The Fletcher-class production plan showed American industrial power at its peak. Between 1942 and 1944, American shipyards built exactly 175 Fletcher-class destroyers, more destroyers than Japan built of all kinds during the whole war. Each ship had radar systems more advanced than anything in the Japanese fleet. The SG radar sets were made by Western Electric, Westinghouse, and General Electric at a speed that Japan couldn't understand. The magnetron tubes at the center of the radar, which Japan couldn't make dependably, were mass-produced in American factories. By the end of the war, the United States had made over 100,000 radar sets of all kinds. The difference was more than just production numbers. American radar got better and better through the war. The SG radar went through many versions, with each new one improving range, accuracy, and the ability to tell targets apart. By 1944, American destroyers had radar systems that could find a surfaced submarine at 18 miles and track a periscope at 3 miles. At the same time, Japanese radar development was stuck. The Naval Electrical Research Department had only 300 staff by August 1943, compared to the MIT Radiation Laboratory's 4,000 workers. Key parts needed materials Japan couldn't get. Most importantly, Japan didn't have the huge electronics industry that supported American radar development. As radar canceled out traditional night fighting methods, the Imperial Navy desperately looked for new strategies. Orders from the combined fleet headquarters started to admit American radar power and stressed wild movements and accepting more deaths. These orders showed a complete surrender to American technological strength. The Imperial Navy that had once looked for night battles now tried to stay away from them. When they had to fight, they used tactics that accepted huge losses for the chance of getting into a torpedo launch position. Training programs had a hard time changing. The torpedo school at Yokosuka tried to create blind launch methods, shooting spreads of torpedoes at calculated spots without seeing the target. The success rates were very low. The Naval War College created new night fighting plans based on accepting terrible losses. Even Japan's submarine force, which was less affected by American radar power at first, soon felt the technology's reach. Fleet submarines trying to charge batteries on the surface at night learned that darkness no longer gave them safety. The SG radar could find a surface submarine at distances over 15 miles, far past what could be seen even in daylight. Japanese submarines, which needed to run on the surface for speed and battery charging, found their ability to operate was crippled. Travel speeds fell from 15 knots on the surface to 3 knots underwater. Battery life cut their underwater time to hours instead of days. American destroyer escorts with radar hunted Japanese submarines with deadly skill. The USS England sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days during May 1944. All were first spotted by radar. Japanese submarine losses became terrible by late 1944. Japanese naval officers saw similarities between their radar problem and the B-29 bombing campaign. Just as American bombers attacked from heights that Japanese fighters couldn't reach, American destroyers attacked from beyond visual range. Technology had made a safe place from which Americans could attack without danger. The mental similarity was perfect. Fighter pilots watching B-29s fly overhead beyond their reach felt the same powerlessness as destroyer crews being shelled by unseen enemies. Traditional warrior skills, bravery, training, and spirit meant nothing against a technological power that stopped a fight from even happening. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 gave the final, terrible proof of how radar changed sea warfare. The biggest naval battle in history became a technology mismatch that showed American power. During the Battle of Samar on October 25, 1944, the destroyer USS Johnston, under Commander Ernest Evans, fought Japanese battleships using radar-guided fire in rain and smoke. Even though they were greatly outmatched, the American destroyer escorts and destroyers used radar to coordinate attacks through smoke screens that blinded Japanese optical rangefinders. The Japanese ships used color-coded dyes in their shells. Yamato used white, Nagato bright pink, Haruna greenish-yellow, and Kongo blood red, so that human spotters could tell where shots were landing. This method, needed because they lacked fire control radar, was a sharp contrast to American radar-controlled automatic firing systems. In Surigao Strait, American destroyers launched planned torpedo attacks from beyond visual range, guided only by radar. The battleship Fuso was torpedoed and sunk by destroyers her crew never saw. Japanese forces entered the strait in small groups and were destroyed by radar-guided fire from ships they couldn't find. The Battle of Vella Gulf on August 6th to 7th, 1943, showed the complete American control of radar-guided fighting. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger's 6 destroyers found 4 Japanese destroyers carrying 950 troops at 11:33 p.m. Using radar, the American force got close to the best torpedo range without being seen. The result was terrible. 3 Japanese destroyers, Hagakaze, Arashi, and Kawakaze, were sunk with 1,010 Japanese sailors and soldiers killed. American deaths were 0. Not one hit was made on U.S. ships. Captain Tamichi Hara, commanding the only Japanese survivor, Shiger, later called it a perfect American victory. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz called the battle a little classic of naval warfare, showing how completely radar had turned the tables in night fighting. On November 25, 1943, Captain Arleigh Burke's destroyer Squadron 23 had another perfect radar victory at Cape St. George. Burke's Little Beavers found 5 Japanese destroyers at 1:41 a.m., followed them without being seen, and launched devastating attacks. 3 Japanese destroyers, Onami, Makinami, and Yugiri, were sunk with 647 Japanese killed. American losses were 0 deaths and 0 damage. Burke's report after the action was cold and factual. Entire engagement conducted by radar plot. Visual contact with enemy never achieved nor required. This battle convinced Japanese naval leaders that night surface fighting was no longer possible against American forces with radar. It was the last surface fight of the Solomon Islands campaign, and basically ended Japanese efforts to use destroyer forces in night battles. American production numbers showed the real technology gap. United States production, 175 Fletcher-class destroyers made between 1942 and 1944. About 1,000 SG radar sets made. Over 100,000 radar sets of all types. 50,000 cavity magnetrons made. 2.5 million radio tubes every month by 1944. 50,000 trained radar technicians. 1.5 billion put into radar development in 1940s money. Japanese production, 32 destroyers of all types between 1942 and 1944. About 300 radar sets in total, of all types. 50,000 radio tubes per month at their best. 500 partly trained radar technicians. Very little money put into radar development. The difference was more than 50 to 1 in key areas. America had more radar sets just on destroyers than Japan made for all uses. Every Fletcher-class destroyer represented an industrial ability Japan wouldn't have for many years. Japanese naval training programs never successfully changed for the radar age. The system of 20 years, night vision training, lookout schools, optical range-finding systems, became outdated overnight, but couldn't be replaced. The few Japanese radar sets they had were basic and not dependable. The Type 22 surface search radar, when it worked, had less than half the ability of the American SG radar. More importantly, it couldn't tell targets apart or guide accurate gunfire. It only used an A-scope display that showed distance as a spike on a line, instead of the SG's revolutionary PPI that showed all contacts on a map-like screen. Training on these lesser sets turned out to be a bad idea. Officers learned not to trust radar after many failures, and went back to using their eyes. Even though it wasn't enough, the waters around Guadalcanal, nicknamed Iron Bottom Sound for the ships on the seafloor, became the place where radar warfare was perfected. The change was recorded in Japanese operational losses during night fights. August-September 1942, Japanese losses were almost the same as American. October-November 1942, Japanese losses were double American. December 1942 to January 1943, Japanese losses were triple American. February 1943 and after, Japanese losses were terrible while American losses were small. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, Japan had lost 40 destroyers in 16 months. According to U.S. Naval Institute sources, the night fighting edge that had been the foundation of Japanese naval strategy was completely turned around. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, which was based in samurai tradition and individual fighting skill, the radar revolution was a cultural disaster. The idea that technology could replace a warrior's skill went against basic Japanese military beliefs. Young Japanese officers raised on stories of samurai bravery and personal combat found it hard to understand a war where the enemy was invisible and could not be reached. The radar gap challenged Japanese racial ideas that had shown Americans as spiritually weak, relying on technology because they didn't have a warrior's courage. Japanese tries to counter American radar showed both cleverness and uselessness. Using window chaff proved to be no match for advanced American radars. Tries at electronic warfare failed completely. Japan did not have the electronics industry to make jamming gear in helpful amounts. The Japanese tried tactical fixes like special paints that were supposed to lower radar reflection, but tests showed these were only slightly helpful at best. By mid-1944, the Naval Technical Department had basically given up on matching American radar technology. The use of kamikaze tactics in October 1944 was Japan's answer to a total defeat, not just to the radar problem. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi put together the first official kamikaze unit on October 19, 1944, at Mabalacat Airfield. His given reason was that with only 40 working planes and poorly trained pilots, normal attacks were pointless. The recorded reasons behind the kamikaze choice included terrible pilot losses, lack of training, loss of control of the air, and not enough resources. Radar problems were never mentioned in documents from that time as a reason for using suicide tactics. The first planned kamikaze attacks on October 25, 1944, happened on the same day as the Battle of Samar, but they were caused by desperation over pilot quality and the number of planes available, not radar issues. Statistics from destroyer fights in the Pacific clearly showed radar's effect. Before the radar era, December 1941 to October 1942, Japanese destroyer losses in night combat were 8. American destroyer losses in night combat were 11. The exchange rate was 1.4 to 1 in Japan's favor. Early radar era, November 1942 to June 1943. Japanese destroyer losses in night combat were 19. American destroyer losses in night combat were 7. The exchange rate was 2.7 to 1 in America's favor. Mature radar era, July 1943 to August 1945. Japanese destroyer losses in night combat were 47. American destroyer losses in night combat were 4. The exchange rate was 11.8 to 1 in America's favor. The technical strength of American radar systems was far beyond Japanese abilities by huge amounts. SG radar, American, frequency 3 GHz 10 cm wavelength. Power output 50 kV, range against a destroyer over 15 nautical miles. Range accuracy plus 40 yards, bearing accuracy plus 0.05 degrees. Display was a planned position indicator PPI. Production was about 1,000 units. Type 22 radar, Japanese, frequency 150 meters and 2 mm wavelength. Power output 2 kV, range against a destroyer 10 nautical miles, best case. Range accuracy plus 300 yards. Bearing accuracy plus in 5 degrees. Display was an A-scope only. Production was about 300 units in total. The details showed generations of technological difference. American radar worked at frequencies that gave better detail, used magnetron tubes Japan couldn't make well, and was connected to fire control systems Japan hadn't created. Captured Japanese equipment and interviews after the war showed how deep the technology gap was. Japanese forces had actually captured examples of British cavity magnetrons early in the war, but couldn't copy them. When they captured radar sets with Yagi antennas, they didn't know these were named after a Japanese inventor, Hidetsugu Yagi, whom their own military had ignored. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey's post-war interviews with Japanese naval officers found everyone agreed that radar had changed sea warfare beyond Japan's ability to adapt. Officers said that by 1943 they knew about the radar gap, but kept it quiet to keep morale up. The Battle of Cape St. George on November 25, 1943, served as the final word on Japanese night fighting power. Captain Arleigh Burke's Destroyer Squadron 23 won a perfect victory through radar, sinking 3 Japanese destroyers without any loss. This battle convinced Japanese naval leaders that night surface combat was no longer possible. Orders from the combined fleet basically stopped night destroyer actions, admitting that the night combat advantage now belongs entirely to the enemy. The MIT Radiation Laboratory should get special credit for changing naval warfare. Started in November 1940 under Dr. Lee Dubridge, it grew to nearly 4,000 employees and designed half of all radar systems used by U.S. forces. The lab's work went far beyond the SG radar, creating over 100 different microwave systems worth $1.5 billion in production. The foundation was the British cavity magnetron, delivered in the Tizard mission of September 1940. This single device, making 1 kilowatt at a 10 cm wavelength, was 100 times more powerful than existing technology. The Americans mass-produced what the British had invented and the Japanese couldn't copy. 9 radiation laboratory staff members would later win Nobel Prizes, but their wartime work was in starting the electronic revolution that changed naval combat from visual fighting to radar-guided warfare. The radar revolution led to major changes in naval strategy that are still here today. Every modern Navy agrees that electronic detection has replaced visual observation as the main way to fight at sea. A United States Naval War College study in 1947 decided that future sea battles will be determined by electronic capabilities rather than seamanship. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force Started in the 1950s, built its main ideas on lessons learned from the radar war. Electronic warfare ability is the foundation of naval power. All other things are less important than having better sensors. Japanese technical officers who understood what radar meant early on were ignored by operational commanders who were stuck in old ways. The few officers trained in electronics became like prophets without honor, predicting defeat while being ignored by leaders who refused to accept the technological facts. This split between technical knowledge and operational plans was deadly. While American forces put radar into every part of naval operations, Japanese commanders kept planning visual-range night attacks even as their ships were destroyed from beyond sight. The final proof of radar's effect came from comparing loss numbers. The switch was complete. Radar changed night combat from a Japanese advantage to American control. The weapon that Japan had perfected over many years was turned against them, with technology they couldn't beat. By the end of the war, of the 70 modern destroyers Japan had at Pearl Harbor, only about a dozen were still working. The Imperial Japanese Navy that had started the war as masters of night combat ended it unable to go out after dark. Commander Tamichi Hara, the only Japanese destroyer captain from Pearl Harbor to survive the whole war, published his memoir, Japanese Destroyer Captain, in 1961. While it has some factual mistakes, his view of the radar war is the most complete first-hand story from the Japanese side. Hara was in 16 major naval battles and saw the complete change in sea warfare. His ship, Amatsukaze, survived the November 13, 1942 battle even with heavy damage from Helena's radar-guided guns. He later commanded the Yahagi and finally the destroyer Shigure, surviving battles where most of his fellow captains died. In his book, Hara criticized Japanese leadership for not realizing how fast the enemy could make new weapons, and for never understanding what technological change meant. He lived to see the Imperial Navy's night fighting power completely turned around by American radar. Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who led the Tokyo Express runs, published his own view in 1956, Japan's losing struggle for Guadalcanal, in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings. He admitted that American radar had completely changed sea warfare, making traditional Japanese night fighting tactics useless. The radar war forced a deep rethinking within Japanese military culture. The basic idea of Bushido, that spiritual strength could beat material weakness, was broken by oscilloscopes and magnetrons. Post-war Japanese military thinking had to find a way to mix traditional warrior culture with technological warfare. The lesson was clear. In modern war, technology is not just helpful, it is supreme. Those who see first win, those who see farthest rule. The final numbers of the radar war in the Pacific give a clear picture of the technological change. Japanese destroyer losses, mainly from surface combat. 1942, November-December, 4 destroyers. 1943, 31 destroyers. 44, 28 destroyers. 1945 to August, 14 destroyers. American destroyer losses in night surface combat. 1942, November-December, 3 destroyers. 1943, 4 destroyers. 1944, 1 destroyer. 45, 0 destroyers. The technology gap by 1944. American destroyers with effective radar, 175. Japanese destroyers with effective radar, 0. American radar range advantage, 200% to 300%. Japanese night vision advantage was completely canceled out. These numbers tell the story of a revolution that changed sea warfare in less than 2 years. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had spent decades mastering night combat, was beaten by technology that didn't exist when their training started. The Fletcher-class destroyers, with their SG radar sets, did something never seen before in military history: the complete removal of an enemy's main tactical advantage through technological strength. Japanese night fighting skill, carefully built up since 1904, was made worthless by magnetrons and oscilloscopes mass-produced in American factories. Commander Tamichi Hara's survival through 16 major battles gave him a special view of this change. From leading Amatsukaze at Guadalcanal, where he first met American radar, to leading Shigure when it was the only survivor at Vella Gulf, he saw the complete reversal of sea warfare. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war sure that their better night fighting skills would make up for America's material advantages. By the end of the war, Radar had proven that technological strength could completely cancel out human skill, training, and tradition. The Fletcher-class destroyers, with their SG radar sets, had not just won the destroyer war. They had fundamentally changed sea warfare from an art to a science, from human skill to electronic detection, from warrior tradition to technological strength. The Japanese officers who survived understood a basic truth. The age of visual naval combat ended in the waters around Guadalcanal, replaced forever by electronic warfare that cared nothing for courage, tradition, or the warrior spirit. They had been the masters of night combat, perfecting their skills over decades of training. But in just 18 months, American radar turned their mastery into something outdated, their skill into something unimportant, and their night-fighting edge into a deadly weakness. The darkness that had been their greatest friend became their grave, and the Americans who used radar became the clear masters of the night. The revolution was complete, unable to be reversed, and devastating. In the end, those who could see won, and those who stayed blind to technological change were doomed to be defeated in the darkness they once ruled.